We tend to assume that predicting global events requires specialized knowledge. The logic feels obvious. The more deeply you understand the history, politics, and economics of a region, the more accurately you can forecast its future. But looking at this graph plotting expertise against accuracy, a paradox emerges. Past a certain, rather quick point, accumulating subject matter expertise actually degrades forecasting accuracy. The absolute worst predictive track records do not belong to dilettantes. They belong to highly credentialed specialists making long-range forecasts inside their own domains, performing worse than simple statistical algorithms. Consider the mid-1980s. Both hawkish and dovish Sovietologists possessed vast archives of data on the USSR, yet nearly all failed to anticipate the sweeping internal reforms that would dismantle the old Cold War order. Their failure was an excess of information. These experts used their conceptual ammunition to aggressively defend rigid models of a totalitarian system, blinding themselves entirely to the mutant reformer emerging from within the Kremlin. To understand why this happens, we have to look at how different minds process ambiguity. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin divided thinkers into two categories based on an ancient Greek fragment. Applying this division to modern forecasting reveals a strict rule. When predicting complex events, accuracy is not predicted by what an expert thinks, their specific ideology or domain. It is predicted strictly by how they think. Before we measure judgment, we have to address the argument that forecasting is entirely impossible. This is radical skepticism, the academic position that human history is constantly driven by random shocks and punctuated equilibria. Skeptics point to path dependency. Tiny, unpredictable advantages at the start of a process can lock societies into rigid outcomes centuries later, defying rational models. They also point to complexity theory. Because political and economic systems are highly nonlinear, a microscopic error in initial data will compound over time into a massive predictive failure. This chart highlights what happens when quantitative models are shattered by chaotic variables. During the 2000 U.S. presidential election, political scientists unanimously declared the race a decisive statistical victory for Al Gore, completely failing to account for the mechanical anomalies of Florida voting machines. If politics is just a random walk, where forecasters constantly claim their failed models were almost right, it raises a serious methodological question. Can good judgment actually be quantified? To answer that, we have to strip away rhetorical excuses and audit expert claims using unsparing mathematical benchmarks of judgment. Evaluating political judgment objectively requires two distinct pillars of measurement: correspondence tests and coherence tests. Correspondence evaluates how accurately a forecaster's subjective probabilities map onto objective reality. Does the world actually do what they expect it to do? This scatter plot shows the difference in empirical accuracy. It breaks down into calibration, how closely assigned probabilities match the real-world frequency of events, and discrimination, the mathematical ability to distinguish occurrences from non-occurrences. Coherence, on the other hand, measures internal logic. It tests how consistently a forecaster integrates new, contradictory data into their existing worldview. This relies on Bayesian updating. When confronted with new evidence that contradicts their model, a forecaster is mathematically required to adjust their prior beliefs. Highly data-driven figures in technology and finance rely explicitly on strict Bayesian updating. You cannot survive in unpredictable markets if you refuse to update your probabilities when the facts change. A statistically valid forecaster cannot simply get it right occasionally. They must demonstrate the cognitive discipline to think the right way when they get it wrong. This brings us back to Berlin's thinkers. First is the hedgehog. Hedgehogs toil exclusively within one tradition. They seek strict theoretical parsimony, searching for simple underlying drivers and viewing the messy world as perfectly predictable or clock-like. This flowchart illustrates how hedgehogs operate.
Because they view history through a single lens, they routinely force diverse data inputs into extreme probability bins, aggressively declaring outcomes as 0% impossibilities or 100% certainties. The psychological driver here is a deep aversion to ambiguity. Hedgehogs possess a high need for rapid closure that keeps their prior opinions intact. When the real world breaks their models, hedgehogs rarely perform a Bayesian update. Instead, they deploy the 7 bastions of expert denial. First is the exogenous shock. They blame their failure on bizarre, unforeseeable forces that fall completely outside the logical scope of their theory. Second is the close call counterfactual. The expert insists their model was perfectly sound, and the predicted event almost happened if not for a trivial accident of history. Third is just off on timing. The expert refuses to concede, insisting the anticipated trend is merely delayed and we simply need to be patient. Even legendary financial speculators fall victim to this specific trap, heavily shorting markets based on rigid macroeconomic models only to lose billions because they were technically right, but years early. Hedgehogs weaponize the paradox of expertise. They use their vast domain knowledge not to seek the truth, but to construct impenetrable rhetorical walls against falsification. The second thinker is the fox. Foxes are eclectic, improvisational thinkers. They possess a high psychological tolerance for ambiguity and cognitive dissonance. Their primary analytical advantage is a method of reasoning called integratively complex thinking. This dialectical loop illustrates the process. Rather than stopping at a first assumption, foxes actively generate arguments both for and against every hypothesis. They advance a reason for an expectation, immediately shift into a critique of that reasoning, and then weave those clashing considerations into a viable synthesis. This constant internal generation of buts and howevers serves a critical function. It applies the mental brakes, preventing the dangerous rhetorical momentum that ruins hedgehog forecasts. In the data, this translates to cautious precision. Foxes recognize that contradictory forces often cancel each other out, so they actively avoid over-predicting radical departures from the status quo, hedging their bets with muddling through scenarios. By allocating their cognitive resources toward ruthless self-criticism rather than ideological self-defense, foxes actively neutralize the hubris of expertise. The data does not completely dismiss the hedgehog. Because hedgehogs are willing to aggressively swing for the fences, when massive, highly improbable historical shocks do occur, it is usually a hedgehog who successfully predicted the discontinuity. Conversely, the fox carries a distinct mathematical vulnerability, cognitive chaos resulting from excessive open-mindedness. This fracturing probability node illustrates the danger of unpacking. When a fox attempts to imagine too many alternative futures simultaneously, they assign likelihoods to so many different scenarios that the total probability of all outcomes exceeds 100%. Trendy open-mindedness degrades into old-fashioned confusion. By seeing too much merit in too many stories, foxes assign high likelihoods to statistically impossible combinations of events. Forecasting is a razor's edge. Rigid closed-mindedness blocks you from learning, but excessive open-mindedness destroys your mathematical calibration. Navigating this tension requires a specialized metacognitive skill known as the art of self-overhearing. It is the active, real-time monitoring of your own mental conversations. You must balance exploiting existing knowledge against exploring new, contradictory data. The most consistently accurate forecasters elevate this self-monitoring into a declaratory cognitive policy. The moment they feel absolute, frictionless certainty about a future outcome, a little voice inside commands them to apply the mental brakes. This is epistemic modesty. Maintaining an acute awareness of your own biases and treating hindsight as a cognitive illusion is the only proven protection against systemic forecasting failure. Superior geopolitical and economic judgment doesn't come from possessing the perfect grand theory. It comes from the discipline of treating your own expertise as a hypothesis to be tested, rather than a fortress to be defended.